Sorry. Hi, everyone. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs at the Hammer Museum, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here today. Thank you. Today's talk is the third installment of our four-part series exploring artist Henri Matisse's artistic evolution, presented by renowned art historian John Walsh. Walsh directed the Getty Museum from 1983 to 2000, transforming its collection through strategic acquisitions while also supervising the planning and completion of the Getty Center. Before the Getty, he curated paintings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Although Walsh officially retired a quarter century ago, clearly retirement was not his style. He continues his work as a researcher and an educator, and lucky for us, he presents his work in talks both here and at Yale University. His online lectures covering European and American art are freely accessible and have attracted over 1 million viewers online. In today's talk, we'll hear about Matisse's work between World War I and World War II as he continued his experiments adapting Cubist ideas to his recognizable forms. We have one final lecture remaining in this series on February 22nd at 3 p.m., and I hope you'll all join us then to complete the journey through Matisse's career. And for the ambitious among you, aiming for top marks in this free art history class, John has prepared reading lists. So you'll find printed copies of the list available today, and they're also up on the Hammer website. Following today's talk, please stay for coffee, tea, and cookies in the theater lobby, and John will be happy to take questions out there. Before we begin, I want to mention 2 upcoming programs we have planned. On Tuesday evening, we'll be joined by the renowned activist, professor, and 2022 MacArthur Fellow, Loretta Ross, for a moving discussion of her latest book, Calling In: How to Start Making Change with Those You'd Rather Cancel. It's a very timely event. I should also say that it's co-sponsored by the UCLA Bidari Kindness Institute and the UCLA Center for the Study of Women. On Wednesday, February 11th, Dr. Zerwat Chowdhury, UCLA Professor of Art History, will speak about our current exhibition, 5 Centuries of Works on Paper. That'll be at 6 p.m. inside our exhibition galleries. I want to thank our members and donors whose generous support enables us to offer us the outstanding lectures, exhibitions, and educational initiatives here at the Hammer Museum year-round. So now, please join me in welcoming back John Walsh.
Oops, it just fell off.
Oh, it did. I'm going to position this. This is our background.
Okay. This thing is important, actually. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody in the theater. Welcome, everybody next door in the screening room. This is the third, as Claudia said, the third lecture. So far, we've seen Matisse get trained in Paris as a painter and conservative, having come from middle-class circumstances in northern France, hardworking but insecure. He became a skilled figure painter. He learned the fundamentals, and then he evolved through realism. A figure painter. He learned the fundamentals, and then he evolved through realism, through impressionism, through the post-impressionism of Cézanne, and the radical pointillism of Seurat and Signac. And in the radiance of the Mediterranean coast, he discovered the surprising freedom of color not to imitate the world, but to convey his own responses to it. He took liberties with color, and with his brush, too, that astonished visitors to exhibitions, but threatened people of conventional tastes. He imagined a dazzling new paradise, inhabited by beautiful young people who were free of inhibitions, figures that he studied in drawings and in his own sculptures. Among the exhibition goers, A few collectors found him to their taste, Leo rather, and Gertrude Stein, and Michael and Sarah Stein, and their friends from Baltimore, the sisters Clarabelle and Etta Cohn. Matisse's long and respectful competitive friendship with Picasso had begun, and the two shared Russian patrons who were keen on modern art and rich enough to bring it from Paris home with them to Moscow. Matisse's love of colorful patterns and his rejection of conventional perspective led him to admire spaceless Persian miniature paintings of 3 centuries earlier. We saw him travel to Morocco, where colors and forms made a lasting impression on him. He returned to his new studio in the Paris suburbs, which he first painted with blue walls and pink floor, that was actual colors, and then repainted it all in red. In that studio, he found stronger impulses to deal with new subjects and on a bigger scale. That's where we left Henri Matisse at the end of the last lecture. Today, we're going to look at the next phase of his career, which was a time of invention, radical invention, to use the title of a brilliant exhibition of a dozen years ago. And we'll continue to into the very different work of the 1920s and 30s. I'm going to begin here with a painting in the same room at the Museum of Modern Art that you can't miss, the 8-foot-high picture of a boy at the piano in Matisse's own house. We'll take some time to look at it and let your eyes move around just to take it in. Well, a boy is looking at the music in front of him, mouth blank, one eye intent, the other eye invisible in a wedge-shaped shadow that points to the music like an arrow. Out the open window on the left is a big wedge of green grass behind a parapet with iron scroll work, patterned like the music stand with the name of the piano maker, Pleyel. On the piano, there's another wedge shape, the metronome that ticks the beat, and a candlestick with a candle melted down, both common discipline, symbols of discipline and hard work. At the far left corner is a sculpture by Matisse himself, a woman in one of the sexier and less classical poses in Matisse's work. And up behind him is a ghostly version of Matisse's least sensuous painted portrait, a woman sitting on a high stool, like a governess. And actually on the right there, that's the actual portrait, which usually hangs nearby at MoMA. The pupil is Matisse's older son, Pierre, aged 16 at the time, and the only other musician in the family besides Matisse who played the violin. You get the impression that he was expected to take music seriously, under supervision, with strict attention. In fact, the picture had evolved from a busy, anecdotal, realistic slice of life into something like an emblematic image of the discipline of art, visual as well as musical. We've got a drawing that Matisse made of the scene. For the painting, he pared down the contents severely. He made Pierre a lot younger. The clutter of music that he drew is gone from the piano. And out the window in the drawing, the mass of plants and pots and trees are all gone now, replaced by grass, green, and shadow that form a long diagonal with the edge of the piano. The wavy spotted curtain in the middle of the drawing becomes a kind of bar of light of blue that's picked up in other places. The edge of the background picture frame became an orange bar. There was a radiator under the window, and it's gone too. A lot of labor went into all that subtraction. The X-ray of a painting, which mostly, of course, registers lead white, the X-ray shows that he painted a whole garden and then painted it out. In the following summer, he went back to the subject, as he often did with other subjects, and he made a version of what he'd originally had in mind in the drawing, but adding a teacher, Pierre's half-sister Marguerite, and Pierre's older brother Jean, there at the bottom, left, only 17 at the time, but presented as a confident adult in a suit with a paperback and a cigarette. In the garden, Matisse's wife Amelia does needlework in a rocker. Above the fish pond is a statue by Matisse, one you've seen before, of the awakening aurora, much bigger than any version that Matisse actually made. The radiator is back. There's an outline drawing to guide him almost everywhere, which you can easily see through the much thinner and washier technique. It's almost like watercolor. And on the piano, a violin in the case, no doubt Matisse's own. The painting has become less severe. It's become a sort of conversation piece, a domestic scene with a pedigree centuries old. So we've got two pictures of nearly the same subject, typical of Matisse. He often repeated himself with a more refined version, or sometimes a more adventurous one, not just reworking the painting, but rethinking it and starting all over. This later painting represents a kind of farewell to Cubism for Matisse. It's a turn away from the shifting, semi-abstract and sometimes puzzling forms of the picture on the left, and toward a more recognizable, sort of anecdotal image and a less reductive geometry. And this is going to last for about a dozen years. Matisse painted portraits in these years too. All of them unconventional, some of them inspired by surprising connections. One was his discovery of African sculpture, masks in particular, which had captivated Picasso 7 years earlier after he'd seen the wooden figure there at the bottom at the left, which he could see because Matisse brought it to the Steins in the fall of 1906. They had others too, like the Fang mask at the top with the big eyebrows. Picasso not only painted himself and Gertrude with stylized faces, but he also created there in the middle a race of heavy-set women with similar mask-like heads. Amélie sits in a garden chair, and Matisse manages to make her stylish and inscrutable. Her head is slightly cocked, attentive, politely, friendly, but her face is flat like an African mask, and her eyes are hollow. The surface is heavily worked. As you might guess, she started as a more realistic likeness. And like Matisse, typically made a lot of changes. He said there were more than 100 sittings before he got it right, and Amélie is reported to have cried when she saw that her more attractive image had disappeared in the process. His patron, Shukin, took it back to Moscow right after the autumn exhibition of 1913, where it had been Matisse's only exhibit. Well, within 2 years, Matisse was ready to experiment with his wife again, there in the middle. This time it was more Cubist than African, and she has a headdress like an abbess, and a kind of no-nonsense expression. The drawing on the left is of a famous violin virtuoso, Eva Mudocci, which is as Cubist as Matisse ever gets. The arms and the dress like crumpled sheet metal, and just the scalloped edge of her hair to soften her. You can see that he pasted 3 sheets of paper as he worked and reworked, testing and changing as he went along. A 19-year-old Brazilian girl was brought by her family that summer to have a portrait drawing made. Yvonne Landsberg was tall and shy and unglamorous. Nobody suspected that Matisse would draw her over and over in various poses and media, in this case using a pen for a quick sketch of her turned, looking sidelong. Now this one was more like what her mother expected, fashionably slim, remote. Matisse was intrigued and asked if he could do a painting of her. The result was not what anybody expected. The picture in Philadelphia is still a very strange experience. Her head sits on her neck like a fluted column. Her brother said that after the first sitting, the portrait, and I'm quoting him, was strikingly recognizable, but then it became more abstract with each sitting. Less like my sister physically, but possibly more spiritually. The white lines incised in the paint with the wooden ends of the paintbrushes. He said, at the end of my sister's last sitting were made while the paint was still wet. And he added that Matisse recovered the whole canvas at each sitting. That is amazing. When Matisse was asked about the strange billowing lines that he scratched in, he really wasn't much help. He said, they were lines of construction which I put in around the figure in such a way as to give it amplitude in space. Alfred Barr wrote that he was reminded of Matisse's Italian futurist contemporaries in Paris and what they call lines of force, projecting the figure into space. He was also reminded of a bud coming into flower, an emblem of the girl's recessive personality opening up. After Yvonne and her family had left, Matisse made a drawing of her from memory that has the flavor of caricature. In the same summer of 1914, he made a series of lithographs reproducing line drawings that describe nude subjects with what looks like the absolute minimum effort. In the case of the woman turning away from us, her entire contour in perhaps 5 continuous lines and a few more added for the hair. I want to return for a minute to Matisse's other way of getting a grasp on a human subject, besides drawing and painting. I'm talking about sculpture. To do that, I want to go back to 1910 and the beginning of this period of experimentation. In that year, he'd made a big drawing of an attractive young woman with a knowing expression, a strong nose and eyebrows. You can see how he worked and reworked her costume. He made a clay sculpture of her head and neck. Later, he cast it in bronze, a bronze that could have a Rodin label without causing much surprise. What is surprising is what Matisse did next. Without bringing her back to the studio, he modeled another version, and he gave her an extravagant, up-to-date hairdo. She also got a bit of chest, like a classical bust, and a pedestal. She got big eyes and a bigger nose, slightly crooked. Everything is more bulbous. And 2 years later, he took a plaster cast of the one at the right, and he attacked it, and off came the hair, making way for a head like a dome. I think it's important to see this three-quarter view of the same piece made by the museum in the studio to show the crumpled ear and faceted left eye that give her the alien character that you don't often get from the front. This comparison reminds us of just how radically photography and lighting and viewpoint can change what we see. This is something Matisse knew, and it's an essential quality of sculpture. This distortion isn't really cubism, it's an application of the freedom that artists were now claiming to exaggerate appearances in the real world for expressive purposes, something that Matisse did again and again. In 1930, Picasso went to a show of Matisse's sculpture in Paris, and the next year he made this. Using his lover, Marie-Thérèse Walter, as his model. So ideas traveled in both directions with these two artists. The Cubist experiment you've seen at the left was painted in Matisse's studio in Paris, which he painted now, but now with a very different approach. The Cubist games are gone. The artist is present, sitting there working at the easel, but he's a kind of generic artist, dummy-like, in a space that's returned to a semblance of conventional perspective with a believable view out the window. Well, Matisse is portraying his situation, his trade even. He's looking at his painting of the woman who's there in the room. On the wall is a plaque, a kind of elaborately decorated item that Matisse collected. I said conventional perspective, but he takes liberties. The bright white of the wall at the left extends all the way down to the floor, and it plays off against the big black shadowed zone next to it. The model on the couch seems too far away. She's nearly the same size as her image on the canvas. It's a picture that trips us up with many little surprises. The model here is a young Italian woman we only know as Laurette. Matisse was fascinated by her and how different she could look, dressed or undressed. For several years, he hired her for 50 or more drawings and prints and paintings. She could be gaunt and grave there at the left, with her black hair merging with that strange curtain that's partly unfolding her and obscuring her. At the top, in green, she could be demure in a pink chair, possibly napping. Or next to her, she could be coquettish on her coffee break. Or at the right, she could be pensive. And at the bottom, she could be voluptuous, in a classical pose with hands behind her head, like sleeping Venus. This amazing picture in the Norton Simon Museum here shows her wrapped in a Spanish shawl, a mantilla, something normally worn around the head and shoulders. And she plays peekaboo with it, but her expression looks bored. There's a work in progress. Here, at the same setting, the same corner, looking across the Seine at the Ile de la Cité, with refinements to come when the artist, who's positioned back where we are, is busy painting the picture, after all, and adjusting it to what he sees and feels, when he returns to his chair to resume sketching his model. And the painting we see was most definitely work in progress. Here's a first quick compositional sketch. It went through many, many changes, a lot of them visible in the X-ray that was taken recently when the painting was studied and restored by the conservation staff at the Phillips collection. The X-ray shows a confusing welter of large and small alterations made at different times and all superimposed on one another. you see big changes, like the lowered position of Laurette, which you can make out in the picture itself from the crackled paint above her. The framed pictures on the wall were moved here and there. Their sizes changed, all part of his repeated efforts to balance the composition, to balance the forms of all the different rectangles, which in perspective are slanted every which way. The curved forms of her body are picked up in the circles and arcs in the ceiling and on the table, and even the arch of the bridge out the window. During this period, 1909 to 1916, Matisse worked on two major projects. One was a painting we'll see in a moment, and the other you've seen in the garden at the Museum of Modern Art, in the 4 bronze reliefs, 6 feet high, there on the north wall. And at the top, just a short walk from here, another set in the Franklin Murphy Sculpture Garden. As you've heard, Matisse often returned to a good idea it had and tried again to make it better, or just explore newer possibilities. This is a row of large relief sculptures, each of a nude woman seen from the back. In this image, I've added at the left a preliminary version, more realistic, which he'd made in clay in 1909 and destroyed later. And we only know it from this photograph. The other 4, we now believe, were made from another clay model that survived 4 campaigns of alteration and plaster casting by Matisse during the next 7 years. He wasn't intending that they be seen together as a series. But after his death, these 4 were cast in bronze and distributed to 9 different museums around the world. Let's just look for a moment. These began with life drawings from several models inspired by Cézanne's many paintings of bathers, often seen from behind. The painting at the top actually belonged to Matisse himself. In the drawing, he was interested in the way that back views, especially of women, revealed a complex of curves created by the symmetries of the leg and the torso, and the tilt of the pelvis, particularly when the model puts more weight on one foot than the other, what the Italians called contrapposto. Being Matisse, nothing is just copied, and as you'll see in the giant nudes in his murals for Albert Barnes, nothing is merely scaled up. He had to work directly on clay or on the wet plaster surface to shape and reshape it, to add and subtract as he worked. I compare the drawing here and the relief at the left. In the relief, her head is turned the other way from the drawing, and in the relief, her weight is on the other foot so that the curve of her spine is opposite. Her arm appears in the sculpture with a hand making a gesture, almost giving the pose an expression of shame or rejection. Her proportions are heavier. Her neck has become a bigger mass. In the pair at the right, after he's reworked the clay model 7 years later, and after experiments with forms that were more schematic, more cubist, her body has different proportions. Slender at the top, with a bigger left buttock. In the sculpture, what was rounded, the shoulder and the left arm, are now faceted. The next 2 reworkings, in the middle and the right, are upright. Their legs have become pairs of columns. No more contrapposto. Their hair is a long tube. The evolution has been toward the schematic, the elemental, And let's just admit how strange this project really was. I mean, have we ever seen in any culture at any time a life-sized relief statue of a woman seen from the back, seemingly pressed halfway into a wall and halfway detached from it, standing sort of ankle deep in water? I haven't. In the bronze, there's no hint of presenting for the conventional male gaze. It's all the more remarkable for an artist who's about to devote a dozen years painting women doing just that, here in Odalisque in the Norton Simon Museum. The other project of this period was just as severe as the bronze backs, and maybe just as demanding, and demanding for us too, you might say, intimidating. It's huge, 13 feet wide, with figures well over life-size, faces blank. Again, let's just look for a moment. The picture evolved over 7 years, beginning with his proposal to Shchukin, proposal for a third painting of the same size for his palace in Moscow, to go with the dance and the music that he was working on. He'd sent his patron the compositional sketch of green vegetation and blue sky and a watercourse where women with realistic proportions and pink skins are washing and drying off and fixing their hair. He'd told Shchukin that since he had painted pictures with what he called whirling dancers and people engrossed in music, he wanted this one, in his words, to be completely calm, a scene of repose, people reclining on the grass, chatting or daydreaming. So how did it get from his first idea, a sort of girls' yoga retreat, to this row of solemn giants? Well, we've now got a better idea of that thanks to research by conservators at the Art Institute of Chicago. They've revealed 3 intermediate stages in the single X-ray. You see the X-ray now. Repeated, but they show if you look closely, show the paint layers superimposed. We distinguish each phase of Matisse's work with the help of those colored lines that were added by the Chicago people to show the outlines of the figures. Now, up in the blue box is the first stage. And comparing it to the watercolor drawing, you see only 4 figures now. The lounging one at the far right has been dismissed, and that the figures are a lot bigger in relation to the overall surface. In the middle, the 2 women at the river are the same, but the ones on either side have new poses. On the left, she's turned away and seen from the back, one arm stretching up, and the one at the right is now toweling herself off. The waterfall has moved to the center, and at the bottom, there's a snake, or if you prefer, a serpent. Blue box, lower left, yellow outlines. Well, since he's rolled it up, taken it to his new studio, unrolled it, stretched it, and made some more changes. The woman in the middle sitting on the riverbank is moved higher up, and she lifts one leg. The one at the right with a towel is drying her back now. Matisse leaves the painting unfinished. blue box. Bottom, orange lines. 3 years later, he's made the figures even taller. The waterfall has disappeared. Notice what survived all this is the snake. In the 3 years between those last two states of the painting, Matisse has had a lot more to think about besides his art and his audience. He's had to think about the war. In 1914, in midsummer, Germany declared war on France and soon invaded Belgium. They took Brussels, and then the French army, even though they had British reinforcements, had to retreat down through Picardy, where Matisse had grown up. The French mobilized their reserves. Tens of thousands of civilians left Paris, and the city was pretty much shut down. Life and work for Matisse and his family were disrupted. He volunteered for service, but he was 44 and he failed his physical. He tried again to enlist, but he couldn't. His artist friends were mostly younger, and they got ready to be sent to the front. The Matisse house in the suburbs was requisitioned as a command post, so the family retreated south to Collioure and tried to live and work normally. The next 3 years were full of reports of horrible carnage and anxious lulls. Matisse was an anxious man even in peacetime, but now he was thoroughly distracted. Paris had been spared by mid-September by the Battle of the Marne, where 25,000 French were killed. This war was mechanized in the ways that the world had never seen. Machine guns and barbed wire made it deadly to advance through no man's land. And trenches were the only defense, but not against poison gas. Soldiers' lives were grim, and they got worse in bad weather. There were howitzers that could send explosives 1.5 miles into enemy lines and behind them. The Germans had gas, and soon there were aircraft that could spy on the enemy and drop bombs on them. So for 4 years, trench warfare stretched from the Atlantic all the way across France and down to the Swiss border. At one point, Matisse was able to return to Paris and get back to work. In the summer of 1916, when he's also painting the piano lesson, the picture we started with here, he gets back to his unfinished bathers. Now there's no toweling, no hair fixing, nothing explicit or anecdotal, no waterfall, no river, just a black band top to bottom. At the left, nature has become a mass of sharp blades. The women are drawn with heavy black outlines. They're shaded with patches that don't depict the fall of light, but seem much more like skin disease. The sitting woman is turned to us more boxer than bather, lacking even the blank oval faces of the others, but instead the head is replaced by a kind of teasing suggestion of a torso. The revisions were laborious. He gave it a mystifying abstract design and a paint surface that's especially thick and layered, even for Matisse. So what's happened since 1909? Where is the scene of repose that Matisse had promised to his Russian client? Where is the bonheur de vivre, the joy of living? A lot has been speculated about what Matisse had in mind here. The mood seems to be his response to the terrible history of those years. The world now as Eden, now in decline, but with the serpent always there. In December 1917, Matisse traveled south to visit his son Jean in the army airfield near Marseille and continued to Nice to spend a few days in the relatively modest Hotel Beau Rivage. He wrote to his wife, "From my open window, you can see the top of a palm tree, white lace curtains, hat rack on the left, armchair with white lace cover on the back, and on the right, a red table with my suitcase on it. The sea, sky, blue. blue, blue. After that, the weather turned cold and cloudy, so he stayed indoors and painted himself as a serious citizen, with not a hint of the bohemian, painting the picture we're looking at here on this canvas, whose unpainted tacking edge peeks out at the right. He straddles his gray paint box and includes his umbrella. Both pictures are a throwback to his style of 20 years earlier. Before his fauve adventures, he lays out another composition here with a quick pencil drawing from a steep perspective, standing up, evidently. He's brought his violin. In those years, he was practicing a lot. The first version of the painting evidently had a vase of flowers and a much lighter color scheme. But when his daughter Marguerite saw it, she said it was pretty. That made him go right back and take out the flowers, repaint the soft pinks and ochres, and intensify the light by contrasting it with deep black. He gives us just a peep out the window, blue waves, and a glimpse under the shade at the tropical plants below. Now, Matisse saw the change in this picture as important. He said, "In it, I have combined all that I've gained recently with what I knew and could do before." So what is it here that he's gained recently? And what was it that he knew and could do before? What he could do before is use painting, especially color, to reawaken his own feelings about what he'd been seeing. And what he had gained recently is the power to arouse unsettling feelings with light and dark, conflict and fear, states of mind in the portraits we've just seen, in the unfinished bathers, and many others. I see that in the situation he painted here. Brilliant, boundless light and air and the sea, but barely glimpsed and almost excluded from his own self-imposed confinement to near darkness. I imagine that he felt the demand of the violin in this little room here that's always there. It's reminding him to work, to improve, to justify him. From now on, we'll see him taking pleasure in rooms like this, sometimes with misgivings. In a different room, in a different mood, something like Cubist geometry comes back. The atmosphere changes. Matisse's son Pierre is visiting, and Matisse gets him to pose in a bare room and paints him from behind, anonymous, silhouetted by black lines, his head in the crossbars of the window, absorbed in his playing. This image of isolated, featureless artist is one we've seen before, the man that we saw in his studio, an avatar of Matisse himself. The hotel management had gotten complaints from guests about his constant practicing on the violin and asked him to do that in the bathroom down the hall instead. When his wife asked him why he was practicing all the time, he said he was afraid of going blind. So he was perfecting his technique, so in case he couldn't paint any longer, he could make a living playing on the street. He might even have been serious about that. In the following winter, he had a bigger room in a better hotel, and he'd begun to find models like this one, who sits on the terrace in a day dress and high heels. Isolation seems to have been good for Matisse's work, but he wasn't entirely out of touch. He had visits from family members. His wife and daughter were back in Paris. His sons now both at war. Living a few miles away at Cagnes was his old friend Renoir. And Matisse went to visit him and his family faithfully. Matisse was 47 years old, Renoir 77, tremendously crippled with arthritis, but still painting and giving Matisse encouragement and an example of total commitment to his work that Matisse was not going to forget. Art until death. The next season, Matisse had moved to rooms with higher ceilings and more delicate light. He was using models who were arriving to find jobs in the new movie studios at Nice, which is becoming the Hollywood of France, and drew attractive young women for movie work or as artist models. Matisse had them pose in street clothes or in various outfits that he bought in Paris or locally in bazaars. And here it's culotte, worn by his favorite model, Antoinette Arnoux. Meanwhile, the war went on a little longer. By spring 1918, the Germans had succeeded in penetrating northern France in a massive offensive and were shelling Paris with even heavier artillery than 4 years before. This was a turbulent and distracting time for Matisse. Amélie and her 25-year-old stepdaughter Marguerite came back from Nice to the house in Issy to pack up the studio, and then Pierre and Marguerite returned to Nice and helped their father move to an apartment, and then to a house outside town, where there was a brief time of reunion for the family. Amélie was tenacious. She insisted on staying in Issy, even after the studio out back had been hit by a couple of stray German shells. Marguerite was having serious health problems. In November, the armistice was signed, however, and Matisse returned to Nice, to the hotels, and then to a large apartment in a studio a block away from the promenade. The house and studio in Issy had survived, and for a time it would remain a base for Matisse and his family. He painted this in the summer of 1919 in the garden, reviving his impressionist techniques for the occasion. He shows Marguerite here, relaxed hostess with her shoe dangling, and his favorite model, Antoinette Arnoux, in white, and having a good scratch, Lily, one of the most sympathetic dogs in the entire history of art, who I thought deserved a detail. Nice became his real base of operations, where Matisse would spend at least half his time for the rest of his life. The new studio was part living space, part stage. There were fabrics and patterned paper and movable screens and tiles, a sort of changing habitat for graceful young women in pleasing costumes, posing as directed by the artist, with not another man in sight. Matisse was there, though. Note the violin case there in the upper right. In painting all this, Matisse has reverted to the sketchy pencil outlines and translucent washy areas of color that suggest forms without much modeling or detail, the way he'd been working before his experiments with Cubism. Seeing Matisse take this step backward, we should look over our shoulder at Picasso now, which Matisse himself had been doing from time to time, and vice versa. Picasso had stepped aside from Cubism a few years before to paint his wife, the ballet dancer Olga Kokolova, in an entirely realistic style, including even Matisse-like fabrics. In the same year, though, he carried on with his Cubist techniques, seeing no contradiction, and went on exploring them, until he didn't, several years later. This is part of a general post-war trend in the arts in France that got the name Return to Order from a book of poems by Cocteau. It was as though order implied that avant-garde art, music, and poetry during the war had been disorder, disrespect for tradition, and that the old rules of the game might be restored to figure painting in France. Well, Matisse had no name for what he was doing, but he had an audience and a following in Europe and the United States. In Nice, he'd found the place and the work that gave the joy of living that he had once pictured as long ago and far away. Here and now was a real-life paradise of warmth and color and ceaseless activity. Matisse produced many hundreds of paintings, drawings, prints, sculptures, right there in Nice. The theme of most of them is cultivated leisure. Women at ease, often alone with their thoughts. At the left, she's still in her shift. She's been reading, but her attention strays away from the book. She slumps a little forward on one arm. And whether Matisse asks her to or not, she takes on the familiar classical pose, symbolic for centuries of melancholy. She leans away from the pleasant colors and textures that fill the rest of the room. In the other picture, goldfish again, creatures that live to amuse our eyes, and cedar cones caught and brought from the from the woods and branches for their perfume, their scent. Matisse drew his model incessantly, sometimes in preparation for paintings, and sometimes returning to his own paintings and varying them. For prints, he drew directly on the plate with the etcher's tool and with the lithographic crayon for transfer drawings. His techniques range from extreme delicacy with a pencil at the left or with charcoal in the other two for stronger effects of light and shade. Some drawings were involved with his modeling of clay for sculptures, though he didn't make many of those in the 1920s. This is the major one in bronze, the biggest, 2.5 feet high, whose pose goes back 20 years to a large lithograph at the left here, and its revival in the 20s at the right. And further back of history, of course, there was a piece by Michelangelo in Florence, you see at the upper left, that Matisse had known since he was an art student. Now and then, Matisse included himself at work. In this case, back at the hotel, sizing up the model, wearing his preferred studio working outfit of striped pants and shirt, also known as pajamas. Some years later, when a photographer came to the studio, the costumes were different. Matisse, professorial in a tweed suit at work, the model in Moroccan regalia, also at work, lounging in an upholstered niche in a pretend harem, giving the artist a sidelong glance. She and her sister models are odalisque, more or less dressed up or dressed down in filmy voile with jewelry and other items from the bazaar, always with lots of pattern fabrics arranged on something like stage flats. The furniture is almost always obviously European, like the models themselves. We're not in the harem. This is dress-up heaven. This is where the artist and the buyer of the picture can enjoy a pleasurable fantasy that carries on a long-respected tradition in art. A century earlier, Delacroix painted private quarters in Tangiers, where men were entertained, including Europeans. The odalisque at the far left meets your gaze in a languid way to invite you in. In the middle, Ingres is more explicit in displaying the taste for female flesh and other privileges of the ruling class of the Ottoman Empire, imaginary Turks and Africans, often enslaved women, like the one being inspected at the right in a painting by Gérôme that was shown to a respectable audience in the Salon of 1866. Matisse made hundreds of images of nude models, paintings, sculptures, prints, almost all good-looking European women, some of them in provocative North African costumes, many with settings and props that evoke a harem. Pictures like this by a white Frenchman in late middle age have come in for disapproval ever since they were made, and a lot of analysis in the 1970s. To a psychiatrist, an artist painting so many of these nudes sounds like sublimation, sounds like guilty desire given a socially respectable form, or maybe just scopophilia, the psychiatrist's peeping Tom compulsion. In the 1970s, Laura Mulvey and John Berger saw these pictures as products of what they called the male gaze, which got a political diagnosis. For the male painter and the male viewer, the pictures don't just titillate. They also assert the power and social privilege of both men. From a different viewpoint, pictures like these have been identified as a form of Orientalism since Edward Said's book of that title almost 50 years ago, studying European fantasies of an exotic and erotic Asia and the Arab and Turkish East. More recently, Matisse's imagery has been labeled colonialist, conditioned by his privilege of traveling to the French colonies of Algeria and Morocco, observing and recording what he chose to see. His biographer, Hilary Sperling, saw a kinder motif. She wrote that Matisse, and I'm quoting her, she wrote that Matisse knew perfectly well that the erotic charge in his work came from a passionate desire that overrode straightforward lust. It was painting itself that seduced him over and over again with each fresh canvas. The picture on the left was bought in 1922 for the French state and went to the official Valhalla for modern artists, not to the Louvre, but to the museum in the Luxembourg Palace. These days, a century later, feminist objections to odalisque, understandable as they are, don't seem to have deflated market values. The painting on the right belonged to David Rockefeller Sr., and when it went to auction 6 years ago, it sold for $81 million. Many of these compositions were produced in lithographs, 50 or more impressions. This one is in the Grunwald collection here at the Hammer. This is the same model in vertical, Henriette Darry-Carrère, who was a dancer and a regular in the studio for 6 years, and a drawing for the painting with a mirror, a device that Matisse liked to use to complicate things. Notice in the painting how the strong checked fabric of the chair and the orangey wall hanging behind pull the composition into balance as a counterweight to the figure and her reflection. Matisse had great respect for models who stuck with him and a sense of humor about the relationship too. One of the steadiest of his regulars was this Henriette, who was not just a ballerina and a model, she was a painter too. And here she's at work with another model who's as tall and slender as she is. While she works at the easel, she wears a demure dress. Next to her is the mirror on the cabinet that you just saw, her leaning against, and in the mirror you can just make out in the model her bright side revealed in the light. Matisse's reputation, beginning in the 1930s and for 40 more years, has suffered on account of gossip about his conduct with his models, as well as changing intellectual fashions, as you've heard. Hilary Sperling's research into primary sources have corrected very many mistakes and let us see Matisse more clearly. By the way, her volume, her 2 volumes are still out there on the used book trade, and they're essential reading. First off, there's been an assumption that Matisse must not only have been sexually involved with his model, but worse, that he exploited vulnerable young women. There's no evidence for that, Sperling shows. After consulting and searching for that evidence in documents and letters for a dozen years, She concludes that, on the contrary, the studio was a healthy workplace where models were well paid and treated as collaborators with Matisse, many of them long-serving, and several of them treated as virtual family members. So la vie bohème of the romantic novels, it wasn't. Exploitation, it wasn't. Sperling writes that, she writes this: "It's not my role to deal with the sexual, moral, and political theories posthumously erected on this basic misconception. Only point out how strongly it has colored attitudes towards Matisse's work, especially to the paintings that he produced in Nice in the 20s and 30s, which remain to this day largely misrepresented and neglected." Matisse's models aren't always odalisque or even seductive nudes. Sometimes they look to be off the clock, or that's the illusion anyway. Here at the left, the windows and blinds are open wide. The clouds make the light mild. And he paints this little picture with delightful touches of transparent color. At any rate, you wonder, are they off-duty? You get the feeling that you're intruding on them. But of course, they're in costume, and they're doing what Matisse asks them to do, posing in languorous poses and looking at you. At the right, there's a little recess that's furnished with gorgeous hangings. There's a chessboard there, but no chess man. So is life imitating art? Is art imitating life? Matisse didn't just paint nudes in the 1920s. Another subject was still life. By 1925, he had several styles to suit his feelings, his responses to the setups. Here he painted a table with a white compote and some fruit and some anemones, a fat copper ewer, some books, all of it on a patterned tablecloth and a painted screen. The patterns are busy, even agitated. One book's title is Philosophy. Another, L'amour, a novel. The third is a recent collection of Jewish jokes by a collector of folk tales. Eclectic, huh? And maybe an in-joke. There is just the slightest underdrawing. The rest is just vigorous, direct brushwork, rapid, with lots of changes as he worked. The other is from the same year. It's the same size. It's more old-fashioned in its way, a kind of return to order, with gorgeous swagged curtains, white tablecloth, and a seemingly casual but careful arrangement of lemons and apricots in a box, and more anemones. There's more light in one, which saturates the colors and softens the edges. The other's more agitated, more linear. Matisse said, "In painting still lifes, I was less interested in the objects themselves than in their visual relationships, the spaces between them, and the light that played across the whole arrangement." So what do you think? If you were in Paris at the gallery of Georges Petit, and he showed you both these pictures, same price, which one would you take home? In a minute, I'm going to actually ask you to choose. So take your time. Okay, people who want the picture on the left, please raise your hand. Picture on the right, please. Whoa. He'd love that. Dead heat. Anyway, won't see. What am I going to do next? I'm going to end this condensed account of Matisse in Nice with the most magnificent of the nudes. Oh, here, I don't know. Here, I have another one for you. I forgot. Yeah, I want you to look at these, please. And you get to take one home. Same deal. Okay, picture on the right. And then on the left. Yeah, wins big. Okay. Um, I think I mentioned already now. Yeah, this is a perfectly amazing nude. The figure is Henriette, when we met, Henriette Derry-Carrière. She's been remodeled and into one of those anatomically schematic bathers. She sits upright. Like a cult figure in a setting that's relentlessly patterned with vibrant colors and a potted plant and lemons before her like a temple offerings. At the end of the 1920s, Matisse was turning 60, and he felt he'd played out the theme of odalisque lounging in domestic settings. He may also have been bored with the task of pleasing a dependable audience of admirers and dealers and buyers. In fact, in the next few years, we're going to be restless ones for Matisse, full of doubts and anxieties and big projects. You'll hear more in the last lecture about how he deals with these uncertainties. He will go through the ordeal and see the glory of his commission from Mr. Barnes in Philadelphia. He breaks new ground for himself as a painter and finds new media. He crafts a whole new language for art. So you'll hear more about that in the next lecture, and you don't want to miss it. Please come back.